let me just say a couple of words about this paper. As you probably know, I'm filling in for Bill Bennett, and this paper, Bob Bennett, excuse me. Bill Bennett is someone else. For Robert Bennett.
You're not big enough.
And I was going to originally comment on his paper. The paper that I circulated was not written for this occasion. It was written to prepare me to give a 10-minute presentation at the con law section on the interpretation-construction distinction at the last AALS meeting. So it's a short paper, and it's extracted from a larger project so that the excerpt you have includes material from semantic originalism and some other material from another long article called The Construction Zone. So that's where the paper comes from. And on this occasion, what I hope to do is to explicate the distinction. That is, the aim is to get clear on the distinction and why it might be valuable to constitutional theory. I'm not going to be concerned about the implications of the distinction. And I'm not going to be advancing a particular theory, either of interpretation or construction. I have a theory of interpretation. I don't actually even have a theory of constitutional construction. But this paper is just about the distinction itself. And in the room is Keith Whittington, whose work reintroduced this distinction into contemporary constitutional theory, and Randy Barnett, who introduced the distinction to me. And what I am trying to do in some sense is to provide a theoretical foundation for a distinction that they make. So the basic idea of the distinction is this, that there are two activities that are distinct. One activity is interpretation. The aim of interpretation, or of constitutional interpretation, is to recover the linguistic meaning of the constitutional text, so that when you have an interpretation, you have determined what the semantic content of the Constitution is. The activity of construction aims at the development, at least in the courts, of constitutional doctrine, and so it provides us with the legal content of rules of constitutional law. Now, this distinction is not a new one. Keith didn't make this up. There's an old common law distinction in American law that runs almost precisely along these lines. But this usage, referring to interpretation to demark the activity of ascertaining linguistic meaning versus construction for the determination of doctrine, this terminology is not the only way these words are used. And obviously, in both the words interpretation and construction are used in a larger sense that encompasses both activities. They're frequently used as synonyms for each other, right? So I think that the adoption of this vocabulary is not arbitrary, right, because it stems from this common law tradition, and it has now become conventional in constitutional discourse, in the discourse of constitutional theory. But nothing hangs on using these particular terms. If you want to substitute other vocabulary to mark the distinction, that's fine with me. And I'm not going to be making any claim that interpretation is necessarily originalist, right? I elsewhere have arguments that we ought to think of interpretation as an originalist activity, but that's not the claim on this occasion, and it would have to be validated, right, by empirical claims about the way language works in general, that is linguistic theory of the philosophy of language, and about the particular case of the Constitution. What is the relationship between these two activities? That is, what is the relationship between interpretation and construction? And there are two pictures of the relationship. And one of the things I want to try to accomplish today is to explain how these two pictures can be reconciled. So the first picture is that these are sort of parallel tracks or two alternative modalities, right? You either do interpretation or you do construction. They're both ways of resolving constitutional cases. And there's a second picture that sees these as two steps or moments, right? So that you do interpretation and then construction. Now, I actually think that those two pictures, right, parallel tracks versus moments, can be reconciled. And that's because these activities come to the fore in different situations. And so let me give you one example of that. Ambiguity versus vagueness, right? So I mean ambiguity versus vagueness. I mean the distinction in the technical sense. So a term or phrase is ambiguous if and only if it has more than one sense. A term is vague if and only if it admits of borderline cases. So there is a sense in which interpretation as an activity comes to the fore in cases of ambiguity. We notice that we're trying to determine semantic content or linguistic meaning when there's more than one possible linguistic meaning, and we have to decide which of these linguistic meanings is the, now you have to fill in your theory of interpretation, which is the original public meaning, which is the original intention of the author of the text, etc. Likewise, when we engage in the resolution of vagueness, right, that is drawing lines to resolve borderline cases, and there are other situations as well. I don't claim vagueness is the only characteristic opportunity for construction. Then construction comes to the fore. In cases of vagueness, interpretation has done its work. We have determined that the semantic content of the text is vague, and that means that something else would have to come in order to resolve the vagueness, and that activity would be construction. So my claim is that this distinction is very useful because it clarifies a lot of the disputed ground in debates about originalism, right? For instance, one of the big intramural disputes among originalists concerns the question, how much work can interpretation do, right? And understanding that question now to be, how much work can the linguistic meaning do? So there are a variety of originalist positions on this question. One position, which is associated with Michael Rappaport and John McGinnis, and is based on the concept of original methods originalism, is that from the linguistic meaning, we can get answers to all or almost all constitutional questions. That's because they believe that the original methods, when they are added to the text, gives us the kind of method that allows the evidence to result in an answer, not a certain answer, right, but better and worse answers to questions of constitutional meaning. And we could talk about that theory in more detail later. I don't endorse this theory, but it's a theory that says linguistic meaning can do almost all the work. And then there are theories that say that it can do less work than that, right? So my theory, I think, says that the meaning of the text, the linguistic meaning, when combined with a rule of construction that requires fidelity to that meaning, that requires that justified interpretations of the Constitution not contradict that meaning, I believe that that can resolve lots of cases, but not all cases, because there are many provisions of the Constitution that are vague. And, for example, Jack Balkin, I think, believes that there is more work for construction to do than I do, and I believe that we can characterize Ronald Dworkin's theory as the theory that construction does all the work, basically, that the text lacks constraining force and can always be overridden by considerations of construction. So the question here is sort of what work can interpretation do, and by seeing that the dispute is about what work can the linguistic meaning do, we can clarify the debates. that there is another way in which I think it can clarify an important constitutional debate. This is discussed in the paper. It's the big debate between, I'm out of time now, and I believe, right, that 10 minutes means 10 minutes. So I'm now in violation of the 10-minute rule. And I'll just say that I think that a lot of the dispute, as I say in the paper, between living constitutionalists and originalists can be clarified by this distinction. So one possibility is the possibility Jack has advanced, that we could be compatibilists about these two theories. Then there are incompatibilists who believe that interpretation does all the work and there's no room for the living constitution. And then there are incompatibilists who believe construction does all the work and there's no room for constraint by the text. And having violated the rule, I'll now sit down.